A student leaves a party, calls for a ride, and cameras track him through a city until he simply vanishes. A British firefighter is vacationing in Thailand, and the last footage shows him sprinting for his hotel, checking over his shoulder. An 84-year-old woman is home safe until a masked figure disconnects her doorbell camera at 1:47 in the morning. Stay to hear the ransom demand that followed. Chills Podcast, same voice, different nightmare. Number 6. When Jack disappeared after a party, a city full of cameras couldn't capture where he went. Jack O'Sullivan was a history graduate, studying law when he disappeared in the early hours of March 3, 2024 in Bristol, England. He had been living with his parents in his hometown, leading a normal, vibrant social life for a young man his age, with support from his family in whatever he chose to do. To his parents, it wasn't unusual when Jack told them he would be attending a house party on the eastern outskirts of the city that Saturday night. His mother even offered to stay up to make sure he arrived home safely. She was prone to worrying, as most mothers are, only, even in her wildest nightmares, she couldn't have foreseen the horrifying events that night would hold. Jack's parents said goodbye that night, not knowing it would be the final time they ever saw him. Jack was in party mode, drinking and enjoying himself without thinking of what would come next. This enjoyment continued uninterrupted until he finally decided to call it a night at 2:53 a.m., leaving the party and giving his mother a call to let her know he would be booking a taxi and that she could finally go to bed. However, 20 minutes later, it appears the taxi still hadn't arrived. Jack was captured on CCTV walking along a road in the nearby area. 10 minutes later, he was on the phone once again, this time to a friend who had been with him at the party. Though the call connected on the second attempt, the line quickly went dead. He was spotted again at 3:25 a.m., then again some 10 minutes later, but then things suddenly went dark. 3 hours passed without a sign. The Find My Friends app briefly showed activity on Jack's phone at 6:44 a.m., but then things went dark for the final time. Jack's parents woke up later that morning and immediately noticed Jack hadn't made it home from his night out. Given the reassuring call he made to his mother the previous night, this was a cause for urgent concern. They reported him missing later that day, prompting an investigation in which police combed through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, only to find Jack slipping into frame, then slipping away just as quickly. It didn't take long for them to uncover the 3-hour gap in his activity between the final time he was spotted on camera and the final movement that was recorded on his phone, and soon after they realized the horrifying implication. Something had happened in those 3 hours that had caused Jack to vanish from the face of the earth. Nobody could say what, but something had happened, and despite their very best efforts, their search just continued to come up short. The chance of finding him becoming slimmer by the second, the investigation took a turn towards the psychological. Inebriated as he was, Jack's state of mind prior to the incident had given no cause for concern whatsoever. As well as the stable household in which he lived, he was an educated young man with real prospects on the horizon. He had no history of mental illness, nor had he been acting erratically in the period leading up to his disappearance. Whatever had happened, it didn't seem like it was his own doing. However, there was one possibility. The area in which Jack was last spotted was not a particularly dangerous one, but at 3, 4, or 5 a.m. in the morning, if something were to go wrong, it could go very wrong, and no one would be there to see it. This is what led investigators to analyze the route Jack had taken, looking for any signs of something or someone that may have harmed him, and that's when they saw it. Jack's route had taken him across a bridge, directly over the Avon River, a deep and fast-flowing body of water that remains unguarded at its edges for many miles. If Jack had fallen in at any point, the cold shock and low visibility could have disoriented him in seconds, and even if he had managed to reach the sheer concrete sides, he would quickly have realized there was no way to grip onto them, and that nobody was around to hear his cries for help. Of course, this was just a theory, and even if it was proven to be true, it didn't explain why the police were still unable to find a body. The absence was enough for Jack's family to cling on to hope, and they had a real reason to believe it was mistaken. For one, the activity on Jack's phone continued late into the daylight hours of the morning, making it the least likely time for him to slip into the river, just as visibility was improving and the effects of the alcohol were wearing off, and the phone call he had made to his mother still rang through her head as time went on. What prevented him from taking that taxi? Why did he decide to wander the streets instead? All of this gave way to a darker possibility his family were reluctant to even consider. Perhaps Jack had come across someone on those dark and empty streets, and perhaps it was the last face he ever saw. All we know is that the case remains open. 22 months later, Jack's parents continue to fight to find their son. He was last spotted wearing a white t-shirt and black jacket, with dark trousers and white trainers. If you have any information about the disappearance of Jack O'Sullivan, contact Avon and Somerset Police or report anonymously through Crime Stoppers. Number 5. A college student was on spring break when she disappeared at the beach. It remains unsolved to this day. What stunned investigators was how quickly she vanished, and they have not determined what happened that night. Sudiksha Konanki was born in India, but was studying at the University of Pittsburgh. Her dream was to achieve a career in medicine. She and 5 fellow students had traveled to the town of Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, planning on celebrating spring break with a week of sunbathing, drinking, and night-long partying. The holiday had begun as planned. Sudiksha and her friends flew out on March 3rd, arriving at the Rio Republica Hotel, where they quickly got into the holiday mood. Over the next few days, the group was drinking heavily, staying out until the early hours of each morning before returning to the hotel in separate groups of 2 or 3. Nothing unusual seemed on the horizon, but on the 6th of March, just 3 days into their vacation, everything changed. The night began as usual. At around 3 a.m., Sudiksha and her friends were seen drinking and enjoying themselves at the hotel bar, only somewhere along the way, they had picked up 2 male companions. One of these was a 22-year-old college student from Iowa named Joshua Reba, who had hit it off with Sudiksha as they had partied earlier that evening. Now, authorities have not publicly alleged that he was responsible for her disappearance, but he was interviewed as part of the investigation. The group continued drinking until 4:15 a.m. when they decided to head towards the beach, perhaps to go for a nighttime swim. They remained at the beach for around 45 minutes before the majority of them headed back to sleep. Only 2 of the 7 remained, Joshua and Sudiksha. What happened next has still not been explained to this day. Joshua awoke nearly 4 hours later, lying on a sunbed with nobody around. Beside him were Sudiksha's clothes, but there was no sign of her anywhere on the beach. Joshua, just like Sudiksha, had been heavily intoxicated the previous night, so he didn't immediately think anything of it. He assumed she had slipped away sometime in the night, forgetting her clothes as she left. It was Sudiksha's friends who had first realized something had gone wrong. Sudiksha was a friendly and grounded person, up for wild fun as much as the rest of them, but never prone to erratic or reckless behavior. At first, they believed she must have gone back to her room, but as the hours passed without a sign, they decided they couldn't wait any longer. Sudiksha was reported missing just after midday that afternoon, leading to a search and investigation that saw her friends all interviewed and Joshua held in custody. It was quickly established that the friends knew little about what had happened, with CCTV confirming that they had returned to the hotel, leaving their friend at the beach. But as for Joshua, his initial story went as follows. Once he and Sudiksha had found themselves left alone at the beach, they decided to go for a swim in the ocean, only to be knocked over by a huge wave as they entered. Joshua claimed he managed to drag her back to shore, but the last time he saw her, she was waist deep in the water. He called out to her to ask if she was okay, but as she responded, he began to cough up seawater, never hearing the response she gave. He passed out on a deck chair, waking later that morning and assuming Sudiksha had left to return to the hotel. Authorities reviewed Joshua's account as part of the investigation. Investigators considered the possibility that Sudiksha had been swept out to sea while Joshua slept. This was made more likely by their heavy intoxication, the low visibility at the time, and the choppy conditions of which Joshua spoke. One detail discussed in relation to the case was that Joshua had experience as a lifeguard. Furthermore, public reporting did not clarify details such as whether Sudiksha could swim or what was communicated at the time of her disappearance. He remained part of the investigation while authorities continued their inquiries. Meanwhile, the parents of Sudiksha traveled to Punta Cana to be directly involved in the search efforts. They made public announcements pleading for information on their daughter, emphasizing her disappearance was completely out of character. A week passed without a sign, then another. With each day passing, the chances of finding her grew slimmer, and Joshua later sought to return to the United States during the investigation. Eventually, he got his wish. Joshua was handed an emergency passport by the United States Embassy in Santo Domenico on the very same day Sudiksha's parents finally gave up hope. As he was on a plane back to the United States, They were calling on the Dominican National Police to declare their daughter legally dead. To this day, the case remains extremely uncertain. While the case remains open in the United States, the Dominican authorities have closed the case as a drowning, something that has drawn significant criticism because her body was never recovered, and Joshua has not been charged with any crime and is no longer considered a person of interest by authorities. Authorities have not publicly identified any suspect in connection with her disappearance. Number 4. British reality star and firefighter Jordan Wright disappeared while on vacation, leaving his fans desperately waiting to find out what had happened. Jordan was from the county of Essex, England, where he had worked as a firefighter and then a DJ before he rose to fame. His first commercial success came on the British reality show X on the Beach, where his previous relationship with fellow reality star Vicky Pattison thrust him into the public eye. Building on the success of the series, Jordan appeared on another show called The Only Way is Essex the following year, making his name as a rising star in the entertainment industry. But then controversy struck as it was alleged that Jordan had been taking paid sick leave from his job on the London Fire Brigade to appear on the show, causing him to quit reality TV altogether to return to firefighting. Just like that, the rising star had been extinguished, and Jordan stepped back from the public eye, never to return again. At least that's what people thought at the time. For those still keeping up with his Instagram page in the years since this incident, it had become apparent that Jordan had moved abroad sometime in late 2025, relocating to Thailand, where he made posts referring to his new life in paradise. Soon enough, however, the illusion was about to be shattered. Sometime in early March 2026, Jordan checked in alone to a hotel in the island of Phuket, known for its tropical beaches and vibrant nightlife. This seemed to be the perfect place for someone whose entire life had been lived amongst the crowds, and a final Instagram post made on the 6th of March showed Jordan soaking in a pool and enjoying the local cuisine. However, just a week later, on the day Jordan was due to check out of the hotel, staff became concerned when there was no sign of the reality star. A search of his room found that he had left his belongings untouched. But once again, he was nowhere to be found, and this was when things started to unravel. Disturbing footage emerged from the night before Jordan's disappearance, showing something appearing to be following him as he sprinted for his hotel room. Checking fearfully over his shoulder, the footage was taken just before midnight on March 12th, the night before he had been due to check out. The search for Jordan began immediately, with support from people who knew him in England. However, the outlook was grim. The hours ticked on, and Jordan's chances of being found became even slimmer, and suddenly more footage emerged that turned the situation into something far more sinister. A video taken outside Jordan's hotel about 12 minutes after the previous one captured a tense conversation between him and another individual on the phone. The identity of the caller on the other end remains unknown, but during their conversation, Jordan appeared to be preparing for a serious confrontation, telling the person on the other end he was going to be gone for a long time and that he had to be able to defend himself. Little more is known of the true nature of the call, but the consequences that emerged just over a week later paint a story of their own. On March 20th, Jordan's lifeless body was found face down in a pool of stagnant water in a drainage ditch near the hotel. No sign of assault was found on Jordan's body, and the detectives who had investigated his room say there was no forced entry or disturbance of any kind, leaving the final moments of Jordan Wright a complete mystery as the investigation remains open. The unsettling footage is the only sign that foul play was involved at all. Number 3. When a pair of twins disappeared one night, they left behind a cryptic message that left investigators baffled. Eliza and Henrietta Huszti were two sisters in a set of triplets, born in Hungary before moving to Scotland in 2015. In Aberdeen, they lived together in an apartment in the city centre, while Eliza worked as a hotel housekeeper and Henrietta worked in a coffee shop. Their financial situation was said to be comfortable, and the pair were supposedly in the process of saving up for a house when all of a sudden, tragedy struck. At 2:12 a.m. on January 7th, 2025, an ambiguous message was sent to the sisters' landlady, informing her that they would not be returning to their apartment. Moments later, the phone was disconnected from the network. Shocked and confused upon waking up to read the message, the landlady reported her concerns to police. Later that morning, they arrived at the apartment to check on the sisters, but what they found stopped them in their tracks. The sisters were nowhere to be seen, though their apartment was still filled with all their belongings. This begged the question, Aside from the sisters' concerning absence, what reason would they have to inform the landlady they were leaving if all their belongings remained in the apartment? And this wasn't all the police had to worry about. The sisters had been living in Aberdeen for the better part of a decade. They weren't new to the city, and everything in their life seemed normal. At least, that was the opinion of their mother, who had called them a few days earlier to find nothing was out of the ordinary. Only, during this phone call, no mention whatsoever had been made by her daughters of their plans to move out of their apartment. As it turns out, nobody knew of this decision, and the hasty way in which the landlady herself was informed was unsettling to say the least. In any case, investigators quickly realized the severity of the situation, immediately beginning a search to find the missing women. As is the case in any investigation like this, a few key likelihoods had to be considered. The most immediate and pressing concern was that the sisters may have been harmed. This might have explained the hasty message and the sisters' failure to inform their family of their plans. However, an even more uncomfortable possibility was also at the forefront. Though their financial situation was secure, and the absence of any history of mental health issues made that possibility seem unlikely, it was impossible to rule out the chance that the sisters had disappeared of their own accord. With this in mind, the officers began to trace the message that had been sent in the middle of the night, discovering it had come from the Tory area of Aberdeen, a district known for its industrial background, its tight-knit community, and the famous River Dee separating it from the city centre. The discovery was significant for more than one reason. The river had played a major role in the lives of Eliza and Henrietta, as they would often visit in the summer months to swim and enjoy themselves. However, the month of January gave a different prospect. If the sisters had somehow entered the river, the risk of freezing was very real. What's more, the tides and currents were more than capable of dragging a person out towards the harbor, meaning the body could be pulled out of sight in a matter of minutes. To begin with, this was just a theory, but soon enough, investigators came across troubling footage. On the day they went missing, the sisters had been pictured walking across the Victoria Bridge on the River Dee. Hours later, at around 2 a.m. in the morning, they returned to the bridge and headed right onto a footpath heading alongside it. This was the last time either of the sisters were seen. By now, the primary theory was becoming more and more likely. It seemed the sisters had entered the river somehow along the bank, sending a message to the landlady just moments before they did. Their presence by the river at such an early hour in the morning was abnormal in itself, and the events that followed raised further concern. However, one problem still remained that prevented officers from sealing the case shut. No bodies had been found anywhere along the river, nor had any been spotted in the harbor. This was not unusual by itself. Many missing persons cases stem from exactly the same circumstances as this, but until their bodies were discovered, there was still hope that Eliza and Henrietta were somehow still alive. Unfortunately, on January 31st, 2 weeks after their disappearance, the sisters' bodies were recovered from the River Dee and one near the Queen Victoria Bridge where the sisters apparently entered. An autopsy confirmed what police already suspected. The sisters had drowned and their deaths were not considered suspicious. Despite this, something was yet to be explained. If the sisters had been comfortable and neither had any history of mental illness, what would compel them to walk into a freezing river in the middle of the night? Furthermore, why did they text the landlady instead of their mother, an act which prolonged the investigation and prevented their family from getting any closure? To this day, many remain unconvinced by the conclusion of this case, with some maintaining that the sisters' deaths may have been an accident, while others favor less common explanations, like folie à deux, in which a mental illness develops in close association between two people. Whatever the reality, we will never truly know what happened on the riverbank that night. Number 2, for 11 days, she vanished without a trace, lost in the Australian outback, with no food, no water, no chance. 26-year-old Carolina was a German tourist who had vanished off the face of the earth in July 2025. She had been traveling alone across the Australian outback in a van, containing all her belongings, when something went wrong. Though exactly what had happened wasn't clear at first. Carolina had set off from Perth in Western Australia, traveling eastwards towards the Wheatbelt region further inland. This is an expansive, isolated plain, spanning hundreds of thousands of kilometers, making it larger than many countries. but more importantly, it's almost entirely empty. The lack of other people is what attracts many to visit the region, and in July 2025, this was exactly what Carolina had in mind, only things did not go as planned. Carolina had been in constant contact with her parents back in Germany, so when they failed to hear from her for a number of days in the middle of her journey, they knew something had gone wrong. Their daughter had been traveling through Australia for around 2 years now, working on mining sites and staying in various hostels around the Perth area. Her semi-nomadic lifestyle meant it was almost impossible to predict where she'd be on a day-to-day basis, so when she went quiet, her parents were left completely in the dark as to her whereabouts. Lost and panicked, they reported her missing, and a few days later on July 4th, Interpol informed the media of Carolina's disappearance, triggering a frantic search to piece together her journey across the outback. Surveillance footage captured primarily at gas stations across the region helped map out her movements over the previous days. A week before her disappearance, she was seen at a service station in 2J, about 86 kilometers northeast of Perth. The next day, she was spotted in the small town of Beacon, a place that is home to only 100 inhabitants. With every piece of footage investigators found, they quickly began to realize that each location in which Carolina popped up was more remote than the last. The CCTV footage of her at the gas station on June 29th would prove to be the final sighting they had. The gap between this final sighting and the point at which Carolina was reported missing gave investigators a rough time frame and area to search within. She had disappeared sometime between June 29th and July 2nd, somewhere in the middle of the Australian outback. The vague details would prove very problematic, but there was something more urgent at the forefront of everyone's minds. The outback is an inhospitable place at the best of times. Everywhere you look, there is endless rolling desert, with almost no landmarks to orientate you, and minimal human presence for hundreds of miles. In the summer, daytime temperatures can easily hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, which can lead to dehydration, sunstroke, and death in a matter of hours. But Carolina was out there in the winter, and that was arguably worse. While the days are milder, the nights can drop sharply towards freezing, meaning you're not only facing dehydration in the day, but also hypothermia in the night. The only hope for someone in this situation is to remain close to their vehicle, since it offers shade, supplies, and can be spotted from above by search and rescue. Unfortunately, days passed without a trace of the distinctive van Carolina had been driving. With thousands of acres searched without success, with each passing day, it became less and less likely that Carolina would reappear alive. Finally, 10 days into the search, a breakthrough was made. What investigators didn't expect was that their success would lead to the most unsettling discovery yet. On July 10th, 10 days after its owner was last spotted, Carolina's van was found wrecked in a ditch, covered in grass and badly damaged. For Carolina's parents, who were in the process of traveling to Australia as the search continued, this discovery was the first good news they had in weeks. Carolina was an experienced traveler, well accustomed to the dangers of the Australian bush. When the van was discovered, they thought for sure that she would be found inside, but that was not the case. Inexplicably, Carolina was nowhere to be found, even as the search swept further and further from the scene of the crash. Some suspected she had camped out in the car for days, only leaving it once she had given up hope of being rescued. Others referenced the strange journey she had taken to reach that point, suggesting Carolina had planned on disappearing into the outback all along. But the most unthinkable explanation was one that nobody wanted to believe. Carolina had begun her trip alone, but if she were to have bumped into somebody along the way, there was nobody else around for 100 miles. The case looks set to end with just the same conclusion as our previous ones. However, not every missing person investigation ends in failure. 11 days into the search, Carolina was spotted through sheer luck by a driver who saw her waving from a road she had been walking along. Carolina was immediately airlifted to hospital, where she was treated for dehydration and injuries sustained during her ordeal. When questioned about what had happened to her, Carolina claimed she had lost control of the van, hitting her head hard in the process. Disoriented after the crash, she had walked for over 18 miles into the wilderness, leaving behind all her supplies and clothing. For the 11 days that she was missing, she survived by drinking rainwater and water from puddles. When she was finally found, she was visibly undernourished and wasn't wearing any shoes, claiming she had given up hope that anyone would find her. Her story became an example of the extremely dangerous nature of the outback, but it shows that searches can still succeed long after all hope has vanished. However, as remarkable as Carolina's survival was, not every case ends that way. Number 1. This final case is still unfolding, and what's known so far raises serious questions. An 84-year-old woman vanished without a trace. When police reviewed her doorbell footage, the truth was far worse than expected. Back in January 2026, Nancy Guthrie was living alone at her home in the Catalina foothills, just outside of Tucson, Arizona. She had lived there for more than 5 decades, long enough to see her children grow up to lead successful lives of their own. Despite the untimely death of their father back in 1988, Nancy was a sharp and independent woman, so when she failed to attend a live-streamed church event the following morning, alarm bells began to ring. As soon as they noticed her absence, a member of her church contacted Nancy's family to inform them, prompting them to pay a visit to her house on the evening of January 31st. Independent as she was, Nancy was known to have chronic issues limiting her mobility. If she had failed to take her medication, or something had happened preventing her from accessing her devices, her absence from the livestream would be a simple explanation, but the truth turned out to be far more disturbing. When her family arrived at her house, Nancy was nowhere to be seen. Quickly realizing that something wasn't right, the family called 911, reporting Nancy missing to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The deputies who arrived on scene agreed with the family's interpretation. Nancy's personal belongings and phone were found inside the house, and there was no indication she had left the premises at all. Additionally, her mobility issues elevated the concern further, since it was extremely unlikely she had left the property unaccompanied. With all this in mind, the outcome seemed even darker. An 84-year-old woman had vanished in the middle of the night, and every sign suggested someone had taken her. But still, the question remained, who would target an elderly woman? Soon enough, the theories began to flow. See, Nancy was not just any lady. She was the mother of NBC News anchor Savannah Guthrie, one of the most well-known anchors in all of the United States. They couldn't be certain, but an attempt to extort money from Savannah by kidnapping her mother was the only explanation that seemed to make any sense at all. Unfortunately, investigators still had to start at the beginning if they were to have any hope of finding her, so they began to put together a timeline, piece by piece, generating a clearer picture of the previous night that goes as follows. At 5:32 p.m., Nancy took an Uber to her other daughter Annie's home for dinner. Present at the house were Annie and her husband, Tommaso, the latter of whom drove Nancy home just before 10 p.m. later that night. Tommaso recalled seeing Nancy's garage door closing as he departed. As far as he was concerned, he had left her safe and sound. Of course, this was only the beginning, because the following day when her disappearance was reported, Nancy had already been missing for over 10 hours. At first, the police were not any more clear on what had happened during this period, with nothing in the house leading them closer to finding a suspect. All they knew was that Nancy was unable to walk 50 yards without assistance, so it was out of the question that she had done this alone. Just as the investigation appeared like it was about to turn cold, the officers stumbled upon something that further raised their concerns. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera from Nancy's home was disconnected by an individual wearing a mask and gloves. 25 minutes later, motion was detected outside of the door once again. It's unclear exactly what followed, but 15 minutes later, Nancy's bedside pacemaker missed its scheduled transmission, meaning she was taken from the home at some point in that short space of time. If investigators had strong suspicions already, it was because they'd seen exactly this kind of thing before. In parts of Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, ransom kidnappings are far more common, bringing worldwide attention due to their high profile and extremely precarious nature. However, Nancy's disappearance had occurred in the United States, in an age and location where surveillance posed a significant risk. For this very reason, the news gripped the nation as soon as it was leaked to the press. Alongside photos of her daughter Savannah, Nancy's photos were plastered on stations all across America. At first, they reported the few facts they knew, but as time passed and new developments arrived, their coverage became a key part in how the case would pan out. On February 2nd, 2 days after Nancy's disappearance, the CBS substation for Arizona reported it had received a ransom letter. demanding payment in exchange for the captive's release. The ransom note contained specific details about Nancy's home and the clothing she was wearing on the night in question. Attached at the end was the kidnapper's demand, millions of dollars in Bitcoin, to be sent to a specific wallet by a deadline that was never disclosed. A further letter was sent 3 days later to the founder of TMZ, allegedly reporting that Nancy was still alive, though she was scared and aware of the demands being made. However, that very same day, a man from California was arrested after allegations he had posed as the kidnapper in order to claim a ransom from the Guthrie family. This called into question the validity of all the correspondence to that point and potentially caused the confusion that would occur over the following days, which nearly blew the entire case into pieces. The confusion began with the first public address given by Nancy's daughter, Savannah. On February 4th, she appeared alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron, stating directly to her mother's kidnappers that the family was ready to talk and would pay to get her back. The following day, the ransom demand reportedly stood at $6 million, with a deadline of 5 p.m. the following day. Unfortunately, this is where the confusion set in. It's unclear exactly what happened between the family's public address on February 7th and the deadline set 2 days later on February 9th, but it appears no money was exchanged, and Nancy remained in her kidnapper's custody. The following weeks went by without much progress. A false alarm went off when gloves matching those worn by the kidnapper were discovered near Nancy's house. They were sent off for DNA testing, but no match was found on the FBI's database. 2 weeks later, they were found to belong to a nearby restaurant worker who was not involved in the incident. By far the biggest focus of any investigative effort was on analyzing the twisted behavior of the man responsible. In addition to the doorbell footage released to the public, it was discovered that the masked individual had been stalking the property in the days leading up to the kidnapping. If it wasn't already clear enough, this all but confirmed the premeditated nature of the act, showcasing perhaps the scariest aspect of all. Intention is the common link that makes these missing persons cases so terrifying. People can disappear without a trace, but when the curtain slips and the threat lurking in the shadows is exposed for all to see, we can no longer pretend it's just an accident. As of recording this, the case of Nancy Guthrie is ongoing, and police appear no closer to finding the answers. A $1 million reward has been offered by Nancy's family for any information leading to the safe return of their mother. And now a quick word from today's sponsor. Here is something most people ignore. Public Wi-Fi at coffee shops, airports, and hotels is convenient, but it is not always secure. Every time you connect, your data can be exposed. That's why I use Proton VPN. It encrypts your connection and hides your IP address, so what you do online stays private. It is based in Switzerland with strong privacy laws and a strict no-log policy. If you want to protect your connection, go to protonvpn.com/chills. Using my link helps support the podcast. Before we wrap up, something most people here do not know: I do not just tell stories, I also make music. If you are curious to hear that side of me, my album Sudiksha is streaming everywhere now. The link is in the description. This has been the Chills Podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Please follow me on Instagram at DylanIsChillinYT with underscores instead of spaces, X at YT_chills, and TikTok at chills. This podcast was made in collaboration with Alexander and Karina. Until next time, bye bye.